The Cecil Hotel. For decades, it's been synonymous with everything that's wrong with the fake veneer of Tinseltown. Located in the area known as Skid Row of Los Angeles, it's seen the darkest of humanity, being once again dragged into the spotlight for all of the wrong reasons in 2013 after the tragic case of Elisa Lam went viral, where a poor woman's body was found on the water tanks on the roof. She was by no means the first tragedy at the Cecil Hotel, and she actually wasn't the last. Countless others have crossed over to the other side, wherever and whatever that might be, within the walls of the Cecil. And it's for that reason that the almost 100-year-old hotel is rumoured to be haunted. But by what? It wasn't always surrounded by such doom and gloom though. In fact, the people who first built the hotel were full of optimism about their new business venture. I mean, of course they were, otherwise they wouldn't have built it, I guess. William Banks was already well experienced in owning hotels, and he'd spied the opportunity in the early 1920s, where more and more people were flocking to downtown LA for business, shopping, restaurants, entertainment, and even government work. Obviously, all of these extra visitors would need somewhere to stay. So, along with Robert H. Shops and Charles L. Dix, set about building this new hotel with the help of architect Lloyd Lester Smith. Originally, it was going to be called the Metropolitan, but eventually Hammer decided to take inspiration from the Cecil Hotel in London, which had been built in 1896. On the 20th of December 1924, the American Cecil Hotel was ready to open its doors, announcing its grand opening in an advert placed in the LA Times. While they had budgeted $1 million to build their new 14-floor, 700-bedroom hotel, it had actually probably come out to more like $2.5 million, which is about $45 million in today's money. But I mean, you can see why. It was designed to be just opulent. You can see that by just looking at photos of the lobby. It's a place where you walk in and just think, wow. Very 1920s, very Art Deco, very much designed to be a place where you would want to be seen. And so for its 700 rooms, you could expect to pay $1.50 for one of the 300 rooms with a shared bathroom and toilet, $2 for one of the 200 rooms with a private toilet but a shared bathroom, and then $2.50 for one of the 200 rooms with a private toilet and bathroom, if you wanted to get really fancy. And it was pretty much filled right from the get-go, hosting a mix of permanent residents, middle-class tourists that were visiting the city, or even people that lived in LA that just wanted a place to stay that was closer to wherever they were going to be partying that night. And so basically, just to sum up the start of the Cecil Hotel, take your preconceptions from what you know about the hotel now, the opposite of that. That was the reputation in the 20s, very much a great hotel that you would want to stay in, until the bubble burst. Before the decade was out, America had sank into the Great Depression, resulting from the stock market crash of October 1929. Unemployment was at its highest. People weren't shopping or going out to eat in the fancy restaurants that surrounded the Cecil Hotel anymore. And where the hotel sits is actually on the edge of a 50-block area, officially known as Central City East. But in real terms, it's known as Skid Row. It's literally even on Google Maps nowadays as Skid Row. And this was already the most deprived area of the city. But people who had lost their jobs and then their homes in the Depression found themselves living on the streets of Skid Row. But this was made even worse by the Dust Bowl, which hit the US in the 30s, which was basically a bunch of dust storms and droughts that decimated farming. So even more people are losing their jobs and were moving out west for work. LA was about as west as you could get, and the job market wasn't exactly peachy. So then you add all of these people laid off from the farms, desperate for work, without anything to their name, also living on the streets of Skid Row. With the Cecil being so close, people who could scrape together enough for a roof over their heads would spend the night at the hotel where they could. But as you can imagine, like so many people living on the streets, during this time, it was not a nice place to be. Violence, drugs, gangs, mental illness, addiction, both outside and inside the Cecil. And even as the economy started to recover, Skid Row remained that last resort for people who found themselves completely down on their luck. And the Cecil, like so many hotels around it, became that very small step up from living outside in a tent. It was never going to be seen as this glitzy, luxurious place to stay again. And so when you're faced with life turning out that way, like maybe you've lost your job, your wife wants a divorce, you've run away from home, whatever it is, and you just can't see a way back from this, the permanent solution to an always temporary problem is always going to look pretty appealing to some people, isn't it? And for seemingly a lot of these people, the Cecil Hotel became the place where they could choose to end it all in relative privacy. And when I say a lot of people, I really do mean a lot of people. It even earned itself the nickname the Suicide or Hotel Death. And there are a lot of recorded cases written about in books, especially Richard Estep's American Hotel Story and Death at the Cecil Hotel by Dale Richard Perelman. But I'm not going to go into every single one and each method because there are a lot, and I'm not about to get my channel shut down because some of them are horrendous. But you can imagine the emotions in the walls of those rooms though, where people have checked into the Cecil Hotel with the express intention of ending their lives. And sometimes it's not a quick thing. They don't get the keys to their room and then immediately flick the off switch on life. It can take hours and sometimes days marinating in that awful emotion of deciding whether or not to go through with it and then working up the courage. Absolutely awful. There was a case in 1927, actually I think the first case, and even before all the Great Depression troubles, where a 52-year-old man called Perelman Cook had become estranged from his wife and son. He'd checked into the Cecil Hotel and written a heartfelt letter to his wife, telling her that he was thinking of ending it all. Kind of like, if I can't have you and our kid in my life, it's not worth living. The days passed and he got no word from his wife. No begging him to reconsider, to just come home, we can work it out. Not even a please get help, nothing. Which, I mean, it was the 20s, therapy wasn't really a thing, so maybe not the last one anyway. And so a week later, Percy wrote another note addressed to the person that would go on to discover his body. And like, you can just imagine the energy and the emotions going on in that room, stewing in all of that for a week. That's a lot. But a popular method that the Cecil Hotel lent itself well to, obviously being over 14 floors, was throwing yourself out the window. And obviously all of these stories are sad, of course they are, but one was just all that more tragic. Because on the 12th of October 1962, 27-year-old Pauline Otten fell 9 stories to her death. The worst part? 65-year-old George Gianni was walking along the pavement at just the wrong time, and both were killed instantly. Initially, police had thought that they must have jumped together out the window, like that's the way that the bodies had fallen. But they found that George still had his hands in his pockets and his shoes were still on. Literally not a care in the world, minding his own business, walking along the pavement. Could one of these many jumpers over the years though have actually been a murder? I mean, it's easy to make it look like a suicide, right? Because on the 14th of March 1937, a 26-year-old Grace Magro fell 9 stories, but she'd actually hit a bunch of telephone wires on her way down, which had broken the fall somewhat. That isn't a good thing though. All it did was slow her fall enough so that she didn't die immediately, and she actually died shortly after of her injuries. She'd been staying in a room with a guy called M.W. Madison, who was a sailor, and who most definitely was not her husband. Madison insisted that he had been asleep at the time when Grace had jumped. But there were a few things that were just a little sketchy. First of all, there was no note, which is weird, but suicide notes in reality aren't actually all that common. I think fewer than half actually leave a note, which I didn't realise the percentage was so low, but there you go. But then also, this bit is, I don't even know. The hotel manager corroborated Madison's story, saying that yes, he was most definitely asleep. But I'm sorry, how on earth would the hotel manager know that Sailor Man is asleep unless he was in the room with them? But no charges were ever filed. There was another absolutely tragic death that happened in 1944. Could it have been a murder? Was it just a huge misunderstanding? Either way, it was so sad. Because in August 1944, a heavily pregnant 19-year-old Dorothy Jean Purcell checked into the Cecil Hotel. She checked in with a 38-year-old man, Ben Levine, and they were posing as a married couple. Although they weren't, and I don't believe he was the father, but I'm not 100% sure. But early in the morning on the 3rd of September, Dorothy went into labour. She didn't want to wake up Ben, so she went into the bathroom on that floor and gave birth completely alone. When the baby was born, Dorothy said that his face was slack and that he was completely lifeless. So she claimed that she thought he was stillborn. Not knowing what to do, she'd just carried this baby to term, just gave birth alone in basically a public toilet of a hotel. Now the poor baby didn't make it. You're gonna be full of emotion. And for some reason, her rational next step was to throw him out the window, where he landed on the roof of the building next door to the Cecil, and then just went back to her room as if nothing happened. But Dorothy had got it wrong. He was alive, as the coroner found that his lungs had filled with air. He'd probably just needed a slap on the bum to get him going. It obviously didn't take long for someone to spot the baby on the roof, so the police started investigating, and it wasn't that hard to track down all the women who looked 9 months pregnant, staying in the vicinity of the building that the boy was found on. They eventually found Dorothy guilty of manslaughter by diminished responsibility, so basically she'd been so emotionally traumatised by what had happened that she'd been temporarily insane when she'd thrown her baby out the window. Just an all-round awful story, just so sad. And this is just a collection of really sad stories today, okay? Just like lots of misery and misfortune bringing out the worst in people. Like on the 4th of June 1964, when one of the permanent residents of the Cecil was found murdered. 65-year-old Goldie Osgood, who went by the nickname Pigeon because she liked to feed the pigeons. She was found in her room 1016 after being stabbed and strangled with a hand towel. Police had no real leads on who could have done this. They did take a guy called Jacques Erlinger in for questioning, and he sounds real sus, right? He was another permanent resident of the hotel. He had bloodstains on his clothes and scratches on his face. But 2 days after arresting him, they let him go, and Pigeon Goldie Osgood's case remains officially unsolved. But the murders themselves aren't the only connections with death that the Cecil has picked up over the years. Apparently, Elizabeth Short, the victim of the infamous infamous unsolved 1947 Black Dahlia murder, was spotted by an LAPD officer called Merrill McBride leaving the Cecil Hotel bar. Merrill had gone on record saying that Elizabeth had ran up to her on the 14th of January 1947, crying, saying that her ex-boyfriend was going to kill her if he saw her with another man. The officer had gone back to the bar with Elizabeth, but the ex wasn't there anymore. Elizabeth had kind of composed herself by that point, and she said she was okay, and the two parted ways. 30 minutes later, Merrill saw Elizabeth leave another bar with 2 sailors and another woman, and she said she was fine, totally okay, and that was that. But that would be the last sighting of Elizabeth Short alive, as her body was found the next morning. And I don't know which bar was the Cecil Hotel bar, whether it was the first bar that the officer went back to with Elizabeth, or the one that she saw Elizabeth leaving from with the sailors. I'm not sure. But the Cecil has also found itself to be the home of 2 serial killers over the years, which, thinking about the reputation that the hotel had at the time, and the location of the hotel being in such a deprived area, it's the perfect place for a monster to hide, right? Drug overdoses on Skid Row would keep the ambulances busy, and literal open gang warfare on the streets kept the police away tending to other emergencies. Easy for a killer to slip in and out of the Cecil without drawing too much attention. The first serial killer to take up residence in the Cecil for a time was none other than Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker. And if you don't know about the Night Stalker, I'm not going to get into it here because he's one of the big heavy hitters that pretty much every single true crime podcast will cover at some point or another. But if you want a more detailed rundown, there is an excellent Netflix documentary mini-series thing called Night Stalker, The Hunt for a Serial Killer. That was absolutely brilliant. Or if you want a deep dive that spares absolutely none of the grisly details, the last podcast on the left, probably my favourite podcast, they did a little 2-parter on him, episode 110 and 111. But basically his whole shtick would be that he would break into any house that caught his eye, didn't really care for sticking to like a certain demographic or anything like that, and would just target what looked like to him to be an easy victim, very opportunistic. And he would do absolutely awful things to his victims before murdering them. And one of his favourite hotels to live out of while he was doing all of this was the Cecil Hotel, and always the 14th floor. Some people say that Richard's room was 1419, there've been like paranormal investigations in there and things, and he may have stayed in that room, but it seems like Richard was in and out of different hotels at the time, so he might have stayed in a few different rooms on the 14th floor, but he kept returning here. He liked the Cecil so much because no one ever saw nothing. No one was going to go squealing about what they may or may not have seen Richard doing, because allegedly he would come back after brutally killing some poor innocent victim, strip off the bloody clothes in the alley behind the hotel, and climb the stairs all the way up to the 14th floor, where he would blast heavy metal music all night, read Anton LaVey's Satanic Bible, and get stoned. His protection from Satan would eventually run out though, as he was caught on the 31st of August 1985 and put on death row, where he died of cancer in 2013. And the other serial killer that operated out of the Cecil Hotel was an Austrian guy called Jacques, or Johann Unterweger, who was known as the Vienna Woods Killer. Again, episode 445 and 446 of the last podcast on the left, everything you need to know about Jack. But this sicko was a serial killer who liked to murder sex workers with their own bra. That was his whole MO. And at the time he was staying in the Cecil Hotel in 1991, he'd actually already gone to prison for a murder and had been released for killing a woman with her own bra. So to the world, he'd apparently bettered himself in prison and had turned over a new leaf and all of this, when in reality he was still going out and murdering sex workers on the sly. As part of his new good boy behaving himself and not killing people fake life that he was leading, he was sent out to the US from Austria to write about attitudes to prostitution and crime in LA. And what better place to stay in LA when you're writing about its seedy underbelly than the Cecil Hotel? It was the perfect spot to get some hands-on experience about the material he was writing about. But Jack just couldn't help himself, could he? He'd actually gone on to murder 3 women in LA between the 11th of June and the 16th of July. He wasn't caught while he was still staying in LA and actually went back to Austria and committed more murders. But you'll be pleased to know that eventually Jacques Unterweger was caught again and charged with 11 murders, which he was found guilty of 9 of them and sentenced to life without the possibility of parole in Austria. And by that I mean you'll be pleased he was caught, not how many murders he was charged with. But the slime bag topped himself the very night he was handed his sentence. Coward. And now by this point we're going into the 2000s, and there's still very much a problem on Skid Row. Drugs are still a major part, and so along with that you've got the violence, the gangs, addiction and mental illness. Still an absolutely awful place to find yourself. And the Cecil Hotel is still in the middle of it, still suffering the same reputation problems, and every now and then guests will report having a weird paranormal experience. But we will get into all of those in good time. In 2011, part of the hotel was rebranded to Stay on Main, which seems to be potentially an attempt to try and move away from that reputation that the Cecil Hotel had earned. Maybe, I don't know. It was marketed as basically like a modern, cheap place to stay in downtown LA, which was exactly what Canadian student Elisa Lam was looking for in 2013, when she set out solo travelling around the west of the USA. And Elisa Lam, she really could have been an hour-long episode alone. There are so many twists and turns in this story story, mainly the conspiracies and the rabbit holes that people have gone down with this. And if you want to learn more about the absolutely heartbreaking story of Elisa Lam, the 4-part Netflix documentary is absolutely excellent. It's called something like Crime Scene Vanishing at the Cecil Hotel, but I'll try and keep this as a really basic outline of the story. So Elisa Lam was a 21-year-old woman who suffered quite badly from mental illness, specifically bipolar disorder. She wanted to go travelling and had gone to California for her first trip. Her parents were a bit iffy about her going, but she promised, "I'll be super careful, I'll call you every night and let you know what I'm up to." And so they'd agreed to let her go. Her first stop had been San Diego before arriving in Los Angeles, checking into the Stay on Main Hotel on the 28th of January 2013. But apparently she was already showing super erratic behaviour by this point. She'd gone to a filming of the Conan O'Brien show on the 30th of January, but apparently she'd had to be ushered out because of her strange behaviour. She was even made to switch rooms at the hotel, because her original room, room 506, was shared with other roommates, and apparently she was acting super weird, leaving notes on their pillows saying stay away and just freaking them out. So on the 31st of January, hotel staff actually moved Elisa to a single room, room 412. But that night, for the first night on her trip, she wouldn't call her parents. Immediately, they were onto the hotel, asking them to go check her room, where they found all of Elisa's things, her ID, purse, clothes, but no Elisa. So she's declared missing on the 1st of February. Police can't figure out where she's gone. They conclude that she can't have gone through any of the doors, they would have seen it. Sniffer dogs pick up on her scent leaving her room, walking along the corridor and then stopping at a window that had a fire escape to the roof outside. But basically the trail ran cold, and that's when the elevator footage was released, and it just went completely viral. Everyone was talking about it, where Elisa's hands are moving in weird ways and just all of her behaviour is very strange, like she's trying to hide or plead with someone. It got millions of views, everyone had an opinion on it, and here's where the paranormal kind of finds itself dragged into the conversation. Because of course she could be hallucinating or actually trying to hide or plead with another resident that might be being aggressive or something like that, but then others were saying that there was an evil force in the hotel that had tormented Elisa and compelled her to end up in the place where she was eventually found. Because almost 3 weeks later, on the 19th of February, a hotel employee was sent up to the water tanks on the roof because guests were complaining about low water pressure and that the water that was coming through was discoloured, had a weird smell and tasted funny. The employee looked in one of the water tanks and found the partially decomposed body of Elisa Lam floating in the water. So then the mystery of what happened really ramped up, and people were convinced that she couldn't have done it to herself, that it must be someone else that murdered her and dumped her in there, or that somehow this evil force was connected. But I think she could have done it to herself, and she did. The toxicology report showed that she didn't have a high enough concentration of her bipolar meds in her blood, meaning that she must have either not been taking them or not taken enough of them. So I think being off her meds in a new place led to or didn't help whatever it was she was going through, and she'd gone to the roof and got herself stuck in one of the water tanks. I know some people will still say that, well, that just doesn't make logical sense. You've got to remember that she wasn't thinking logically. I know it's not the most sensational explanation either, but usually the one that's the least likely to draw in a crowd is the one that's closest to the truth. But then people saying that the lid to the water tank was closed, and she wouldn't have been able to do that if she'd have just jumped into the water tank herself. So that's proving that there must be foul play going on, like someone else must be involved, right? But I'm pretty sure that the maintenance man said that he'd come across it and it was open while they were first searching for Elisa. Like obviously they would have done an initial first sweep of the roof just to make sure, and then he just closed it. Like obviously it shouldn't have been open, so maybe he just went and just close the lid, and then he must have just like not seen her in there or something. Either way, I really don't think that there was anything paranormal going on here. I really think it was just a tragic, unfortunate incident that just so happened to happen at the Cecil Hotel. But Elisa's case would absolutely forever tie the Cecil Hotel to the paranormal, way more so than it had already been, as we are about to find out. Because in 2017, the Cecil closed its doors for a complete renovation, and it was during this time that Ghost Adventures managed to gain access for a 2-hour special episode. Because by this point now, it had this reputation of being extremely haunted, and then all of the paranormal theories around Elisa Lam just added to that. And I remember when this Ghost Adventure special first came out on Discovery Plus, I was so excited to watch it, and it was good. As far as Ghost Adventures episodes go, it's fine, but it was right here where I decided that creating this YouTube channel would be an amazing idea, that learning about the history and about what actually happened in a building was so much more interesting to me than night vision footage. So you've got Zach Bagans and the Cecil Hotel special to thank for Don't Scare Claire. Anyway, they were were doing this interview with a former crime scene photographer who was saying that he'd stayed in Elisa Lam's room 412, and that he'd claimed that he'd felt unseen hands around his throat. And this seems to be reported pretty often by people that are staying in the Cecil Hotel. There was a woman called Joy Johnston who wrote a blog post about her dad's experience. He was living in the Cecil not long after moving to the US in 1965, and one night he was there in bed and he woke up in the middle of the night. Couldn't move a single muscle. There was a weight on his chest, and he said that he felt hands around his throat, again, squeezing. As quickly as the feeling had come on, it went away. I don't know, it just sounds to me like sleep paralysis. But either way, Joy's dad was so shaken up by what had happened that he ran down to reception to tell them what he'd just experienced. The night clerk was like, oh yeah, there was a murder that happened in that room like not too long ago. Which, what was the night clerk on to just be saying that to someone who's just had this terrifying experience? But either way, he was able to move rooms and never experienced anything weird after that. No sleep paralysis, nothing. Which, I mean, Goldie Osgood was murdered in 1964. Was it that Joy's dad was staying in the room where she was found? Interesting. And it was during this time, while it was closed in 2017, but ended up kind of being like a long-term closure with a pandemic and things, so the hotel was pretty much completely abandoned, that a guy living opposite the hotel, Pete Monzigo, was apparently documenting weird things happening. Like he was watching all of this from his apartment across the street. So he'd noticed strange lights flicking on and off in the rooms. Doors would open and close by themselves when he could see that the room was empty. And one night he saw the figure of an old man sitting by the window in one of the rooms. This old man was smoking a cigar and seemingly just watching the world go by. But what was really weird about this whole encounter was Pete's apartment was in complete darkness at this point. He got all the lights turned off. But as Pete walked from one window to the next in his apartment, the old man's head turned to follow him. Obviously this freaked him out, so he hid behind his sofa, as you do. And when he poked his head back out to look through the window at the old man, he'd disappeared. In 2021, the hotel actually opened up as affordable housing for permanent residents, so it doesn't actually operate as a hotel anymore. And it was at this point that Pete made friends with one of the permanent residents and got to go inside the Cecil. And he said that the energy just felt really bad and ominous, like you're constantly being watched. But that may have had more to do with what happened next, because Pete was actually held at gunpoint by one of the other residents. Right, because for all of this talk of ghosts and the history and stuff, it's still a very dangerous place to live in a very deprived area. And throughout its years, especially recently, the ghost talk got really downplayed by the owners. Like staff, while it was still running as a hotel, would not entertain a conversation with anyone that was interested in the paranormal. So obviously it already had that reputation before Elisa Lam, but after that, people were flocking to the Cecil to try and do an investigation. They even got to the point where they would play music in the corridors to try and stop people conducting EVP sessions. And so with all of its history, you could see why the Cecil Hotel would be a good contender for being a haunted building, right? I mean, it literally had the nickname Hotel Death. And the hotel manager from 2010 to 2017, Amy Price, she estimated that there must have been around 18 natural and unnatural deaths during her time there, which may have been an exaggeration on her side. But even so, it kind of just gives you an indicator of the sheer scale of death we're talking about here. Because I don't know, it just seems a hell of a lot higher to me than the 16 that our old pal Wikipedia states. But who is actually haunting the hotel? Apparently Richard Ramirez's room on the 14th floor, that's said to have a really evil, malevolent atmosphere, but not specifically said to be haunted by Ramirez himself. Jack Unterweger, the other serial killer that lived in the Cecil for a time, he has no paranormal connections to the place. Some people claim to have made contact with Elisa Lam during their investigations, but other than that, that's kind of it. And from what I could see, like even up to today, none of the permanent residents have gone online to report anything weird from their time living there. It's more just that in certain areas of the hotel, there's a really creepy vibe, which could have more to do with your neighbours. But then you've got to think about it, like it's a huge hotel designed to house like 600 people now. Footsteps and doors slamming are kind of going to be the soundtrack to your day, so it's going to be harder to say for sure whether something's unexplainable, isn't it? But even if the claims of paranormal activity have been exaggerated over the years, I think between the thought of the horrendous things that have happened here during its lifetime and the things that continue to happen here to this day, I'm pretty sure I wouldn't get a good night's sleep if I was to stay there overnight. So what do you think? Do you think that the Cecil Hotel is as haunted as it's been made out to be over the years? Or is the paranormal just a juicy extra detail in this hotel's long and not very happy history? I don't doubt that the Cecil Hotel could be haunted. You have that much death and just all around misery, there's the recipe for your ghosts, you know? So much so that the Cecil was actually the inspiration for the American Horror Story hotel season. But also, yes, it's had a very sad history with a lot of death connected to it, with links to serial killers and all sorts, but it's not special. Maybe that's the wrong word. It's not unique. The Elisa Lam case made the Cecil Hotel just basically go viral, which put a spotlight on the other tragic things that have happened here over the years. But it would be interesting to know about other hotels in the area that I'm guessing will be just as full of people that have hit rock bottom, that are down on their luck, that are experiencing the worst times of their life, and then that they're maybe going through drug addiction, mental illness, all the other things that can lead to tragic stories that YouTubers can make a living talking about on the internet. Don't know if I'm being very clear at what I'm getting at, but basically, yes, I wouldn't be surprised if someone came to me in the comments and said, Claire, the Cecil Hotel is haunted, these are the things that I've experienced here, and these are the people from those stories that you mentioned that still haunt the place, and then proceeded to mention names like Goldie Osgood and Percy Orman Cook, or even names of people from incidents that I haven't mentioned. Like, don't forget, Elisa was the most famous, but she wasn't even the last. Even in 2015, there was a man that was found on the pavement outside the hotel. They don't know if he jumped or if he was pushed. They don't know anything about him. But also, there is something in the back of my mind that just makes me think, is it just because of all of these sad stories that people are convinced that the stories alone must mean that it's haunted? And there's no way that it couldn't be, because a lot of the current residents are adamant that there is absolutely nothing paranormal going on there now. But please do let me know what you think. I feel like today's episode, it touched on some huge topics in themselves, so hopefully I gave you a good enough outline of them in the context of the Cecil. I'm not about to become yet another true crime channel, but if you're interested in any of the true crime cases I mentioned, the sources that I recommend are absolutely brilliant. I will list them in the description too. And if you enjoyed this video, you'd absolutely help me to feel a million times better if you could leave me a little like. And thank you for being so patient with me while I was getting this one out to you. And please do subscribe if you haven't already. I'd love to chat with you about ghosts again. But anyway, that is all from me today. I cannot wait to chat with you more about the morbid, mysterious and macabre. So until next time, sleep safe. So this is my second attempt at recording this. Let's see how this goes. I still sound minging.